One has to be free to bring to bear his or her moral and spiritual convictions on those fundamental questions.
It's interesting because it's exactly what President Obama did in his campaign. He introduced this discussion of morality into the political discourse, right?
It's interesting. He did during the campaign.
The campaign.
And this was a departure from what many previous liberals or Democrats had done. They had tended to be more technocratic and more uneasy with moral and spiritual
The liberal
questions.
tradition is not to talk about religion and morality.
Right. And Obama's strength coming out of the liberal and progressive tradition was to say, we can't ignore moral and spiritual questions. It's a mistake if we do, because then that leaves the richest, most powerful moral resources to religious conservatives only. And so he was right about that. Not only was he right, I think it was a source of his inspirational appeal. People want public life to be about things that matter, about big, sometimes big moral questions. Now, he did that successfully in his campaign. He's not been as successful at translating that moral and civic idealism into governing, into his presidency. And the challenge now, I think, for him is to reconnect with that larger moral vocabulary, because that's really what moved people and stirred people and inspired people.
But maybe it's because power always requires a compromise, and you compromise on your moral values too. I mean, who other American presidents were like great moral leaders other than Lincoln?
Well, you look at Lincoln. Lincoln is a good example. He brought, if you look at his speeches, famous speeches, he was very attuned to the moral and spiritual dimensions of politics. That's why we remember him. So I think real political leadership requires that political leaders and not only welcome moral and spiritual language in politics, but that they encourage in citizens the ability to do that as well, and in a way invite citizens to become philosophers. There's something, I think there's a hunger for that, because too often our politics doesn't let us do that.
It's very moving to watch your lectures, to see these young people standing up and talking about things that normally people don't talk about. What is the higher good? What is freedom? And the fact that you bring to them Aristotle, which is this idea of the higher purpose. There's a word that we in Portuguese we say telos. It's from the Greek.
Telos, yes.
It's as easy for us. In English it's telos, right?
Yes.
So tell us about that. How the young people relate to that idea.
What I want first is to present to the students and to the readers of the book the main philosophical ideas that inform contemporary politics, which is for the most part a clash between those who believe in free market, property rights, libertarian ideas, or utilitarian ideas, maximizing GDP, and those who say we also have to have a decent welfare state to respect the rights of the poor, to make sure they don't fall through without a safety net. So those are our familiar debates. Lower taxes, higher taxes, more government regulation, less government regulation. Those are our familiar debates. But then I want to move beyond those debates to remind students that there is another way of thinking about public life. Aristotle, with his idea of telos, or purpose, says the telos of political community is not economics writ large. It's not just another way of getting what we want as individual consumers. That's a market. Maybe it's a big market, maybe it's a global market, but it's not a political community. And the reason it's not, he says, is that political community is for the sake of something higher. It's for the sake of the good life. The reason, ultimately, that we come together in political communities is to make us better, to elevate our characters, to learn how to deliberate with one another, to exercise our human faculty for judgment. This is the telos, he says, the telos of political community. And it's connected to our human nature, to what it is to be a human being. His idea is we couldn't, and I think there's a lot to this idea, we couldn't fully realize ourselves as human beings just living as purely private lives, as consumers. That's not all there is to life. Human beings are shaped by engaging in one another in a common life, deliberating, sharing in self-rule. This affects our character, our capacity to develop judgment and concern and a sense of mutual responsibility for one another. So ultimately, this goes back to what I was suggesting earlier. I don't think we can or should separate questions of the good life from questions of politics and how to govern ourselves.
I like that idea of the narrative concept of the subject, that we are part of a larger narrative.
Yes.
My personal narrative is part of a larger narrative.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
explain that.
Yeah, and this too comes up toward the end of the book and the end of the lectures. There is a tendency to think that the highest freedom to be a free human being is to be able to define myself by myself without reference to my past or my tradition or my upbringing or my culture.
An abstract being.
An abstract being, an abstract self. The pure, self-creating individual. There is something very powerful about that idea, but I think it's mistaken. I think it's an illusion. What it misses is, just as you say, the narrative aspect of identity. Who I am is inseparable from my story, the narrative of my life, which locates me in the world in relation to a past, to a tradition, to a family, neighborhood, community, country, and ultimately to a global society. But the narratives, the stories of those particular settings and identities are part of what make me who I am. That's the narrative conception of the self that I favor as it's a kind of counterweight to the kind of radical individualism that we are drifting toward in consumer-driven, market-driven society.
You warn your students that moral philosophy, all this discussion is dangerous because
Yes.
after you question the familiar,
Yes.
you'll never be the same again.
That's right.
After you start to ask, what are your motives?
Right.
Right?
Right, it's true. And students come to me after the class and sometimes years later, and they say, this is exactly what I experienced. Once you begin to question settled assumptions and conventions, life is never quite the same again. That is the danger of doing political philosophy in this way, but it's also the beauty and the exhilaration of it. Because what it means ultimately, I think, to be a human being is to question, to be restless about our assumptions. That's what philosophy is about. And so this sense of being unsettled and uneasy, that's the first step in teaching. It's the first step, I think, in civic education, and for that matter, I think in aspiring to live a good life.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
Very
My
good.
pleasure.
Excellent.
My pleasure.
Very beautiful.
Thank you.
Para saber mais sobre essa entrevista e deixar a sua opinião, visite o blog do Milênio. Até lá.